and welcome. Oh, got it. All right, now we're recording. All right, hello. Welcome to our latest Fair Housing Friday housing crisis in the Connecticut River Valley. We are joined here today by Jordyn Fitch and Maeve. I should have asked for your last name pronunciation before. Littau?
Littau.
Maeve Littau. Both documentarians and community organizers very involved in advocating for housing and tenants' rights in their region. They're calling in from Junction Arts Media in White River Junction. And I'll just add to, this is, I don't say this every time, I swear, but this is a really great Fair Housing Friday for us because we've been working with Jordyn the past few months planning for Fair Housing Month, and Junction Arts Media just had some really incredible housing programming this past month or two, some of which I was able to go down for, and always at the Housing Advocacy Program of CVOEO. We're just really happy to have partners in other places in the state. And then Maeve and Jordyn, I'm just going to do like a little bit of an intro, and then I'll let you both play the preview. Sound good? Okay. So for those who don't know, this Fair Housing Friday is part of our month-long programming for Fair Housing Month. So every year in April, we at CVOEO's Fair Housing Project celebrate the passage of the Fair Housing Act, which passed in 1968 on April 11th and put into essential protections into law, making it illegal to discriminate in the rental, sale, or financing of housing based on race, color, national origin, religion, sex, family status, and disability. Each state has the opportunity to expand on the Fair Housing Act, and not every state does, but in Vermont we have. So in Vermont, we have the additional protections of age, marital status, sexual orientation, gender identity, receipt of public assistance, such as Section 8, denial of development permitting based on income of prospective residents, and then most recently, victims of abuse, sexual assault, and stalking. So that means it's against the law for you to be treated unfairly because of your membership to any of the federal or state protected classes. But, you know, here at the Fair Housing Project, we know that discrimination is not always obvious and can take many forms. It can happen when a landlord refuses to rent an apartment to you, or tells you it's unavailable when it's vacant, or it might mean that the landlord's giving different terms and conditions in your lease. So there's lots of complicated ways to think about the Fair Housing Act, and we're always happy at the Fair Housing Project to kind of do a workshop for your community, and we have lots of tenants resources as well with Vermont tenants. And then just to say too, part of the reason why we do the programming that we do in April at CVOEO's Fair Housing Project is that we understand that furthering housing inclusion entails more than just talking about the Fair Housing Act. And we also just really love the opportunity to call the community in and some creative discussions and make the housing conversation more accessible, which obviously we need to do right now. I think everyone on this call, and as we'll hear from Jordyn and Maeve, know we have a serious housing shortage. And that means that the folks that have always been denied equal access to housing are disproportionately affected by our housing shortage. So we are charged with doing what we can to help educate folks about housing, our housing needs, and really advocate for inclusive housing. So with that said, Jordyn and Maeve have a preview of a documentary that they've been working on to share with us. Both incredible media makers, documentarians, community organizers down in the White River Junction Valley region. And I think before I talk away this Zoom webinar, I'll pass the mic to you both.
Oh, sick. Thank you for that glowing introduction. Yeah, I will share. We put together like a trailer for the project that we're working on, and we'll show that. It's about almost 3 minutes. Just kind of a sneak peek into. I'll give a little bit of context. Just I don't know, a couple months ago, Samantha, my boss here at Junction Arts and Media, our executive director, kind of just gave me a little bit of free will, said I want GM to start producing kind of our own content and deciding kind of what we wanted to focus on. And she asked like if there was a project or a topic or something that I had a particular interest in, if I did like a proposal, we would get a little bit of funding to be able to make a documentary. And I had recently just gotten involved in tenant organizing. And so I communicated like this is something I'm really passionate about, and that's kind of where this documentary started. And then as I started working more and more with Corinne and the others in our really cool like fair housing group planning meetings, it kind of evolved and it became less specific about, I think, tenant organizing and more a little bit broadly recognizing that there is just a really big problem with housing in our region, and just kind of wanting to explore a little bit more what that problem was and what are the things causing it, and potentially like what are we going to do about it. I still don't really know those answers yet, but we definitely ask those questions, and and yeah, in this process we've just kind of been learning as we've been going, and it's been a really kind of exploratory documentary process. Yeah, not really knowing what we're gonna get, but let's just share our preview. Yeah, I think that should work. All right.
The current housing situation in the Upper Valley is bleak.
Well, in a word, I think the word would be crisis.
Dire, I think.
There is an affordable housing crisis in the town, the region, statewide, also nationally.
We're in a housing crisis. Over time, we've had a slowing down of the housing production and an increased demand for the housing production. So now we've got this huge gap between what people need, where they need it, the cost that they need it at, the type of housing that they need it at, and what's actually available on the market.
Everyone's so desperate for housing, and you're lucky if you can get it. That means the landlords can charge more. So that's all an expression of collapse.
We're actually losing important staff that we need that are, providers of these services for folks, because they, either can't afford to live here or are getting priced out, or can't afford to, move here.
Rather than the housing system being designed to meet people's needs, the housing system is designed to be profitable to capital owners.
Rural poverty and rural homelessness is rampant.
We received notices simply stating that the rent would be almost double what it had been, and sign here if you agree. If not, then, when will you be out, basically.
We need to be held accountable to centering folks who are most impacted, and there are ways that we are doing that, and there are ways that we need to be doing that more and better.
Someone feels how they feel, and if they feel afraid to walk down the street on Hartford Avenue or wherever, you can't tell them that they're wrong. That is a feeling that they have.
Well, do you have any statistical data to support that these unhoused folks are a threat to you? We have plenty to suggest that the rest of the community is a threat to them.
And then that letter was quickly followed up by no-cause evictions.
I don't think the select board is doing enough, honestly.
It's nothing short of exploitation by people with power and with money.
Oh, okay. And we're back.
Yay. I'm so excited for the whole documentary. And I figure we can start with me asking you all some questions, and then we might even open it up for the audience. We will open it up for the audience to ask some questions as well. And I just like, ooh, like what a note for that preview to end on, the contrasting views of around safety, which is something that comes up so much in our advocacy around affordable housing. This perception of you know, bringing in housing that is housing that we need all across the state, as we all well know. But as soon as the proposal is kind of coming in, there's often a community pushback that's very fear-based, just as we heard, I don't feel safe. And it's just a really difficult conversation to navigate. So anyways, I'm curious to hear more of what you learned in making it. But I think if we could step back for a second and ask, why did you decide to go down, you kind of talked about tenant organizing, but why are you involved in tenant organizing? Why is housing something that, really is important enough that you are spending time to make this documentary?
Yeah, do you want to go first?
You can go.
Okay, yeah, so we both got into tenant organizing fairly recently, just about a year ago. And I think we both believe that like housing is a right, like it's a basic human need, like you can't live without housing, even though a lot of people are being forced to right now. And for me, I got into it because I recognized that it's like for several decades in our country, the owning of real estate and housing has been one of the main ways people build wealth and capital and accumulate capital. And so organizing tenants builds power amongst the working class in a way that they can kind of balance out that power differential. And because as things stand now, tenant or landlords have tremendous power over their tenants. If a tenant wants, or if a landlord wants to evict a tenant, there's basically nothing they can do. They'll eventually find a way, and a lot of protections that exist around like labor organizing and like workers' rights don't really exist for tenants. And so yeah, I think for all those reasons, tenant organizing stood out as something that's kind of like crucial right now in this contemporary moment for me.
You summed it up pretty well.
Yeah, nothing to add, Jordyn?
No, I don't think so. I mean, yeah, I'm trying to think. I don't know. For all the reasons that they said, particularly, I think when we came here, when we started living here, I think was when we got into tenant organizing specifically. We had first really started getting into community organizing when we lived back in Tacoma. Joined the local DSA chapter there, and kind of like in that moment and in that place where we found ourselves doing a lot of organizing around reproductive justice and reproductive rights, and coordinating and organizing lots of like abortion clinic defenses and things of that nature. Just because I think just that was where we were needed. That's where things were. I don't know, there was an expressed concern and like a community need for that. And so I think kind of in the same way when we moved here and kind of fell into the DSA chapter here, the UVDSA, it was the kind of tenant organizing wing was one that we immediately recognized that there were lots and lots of tenants who needed help and didn't really know where to get that help or where to go. And we just kind of were like, yeah, well, if this is a place where our energy can be used, like let's put it into this. And we've made a lot of really, really cool friends who are in our kind of tenant specific organizing group. And yeah, we've got a lot to learn. We're a baby fledgling union, haven't quite managed to unionize a building yet, but constantly learning, constantly trying, constantly just like trying to at least just be someone that tenants can reach out to, if only just to know that like they're heard and that there is someone who is like, I don't know, willing to try and help. It's an interesting positionality too, because like I feel like a union is, or the point, not the point, but the helpful mechanism for it is like you need to have members or like people who are kind of like you organize around like a building or a landlord or a specific thing to have that, to form that collective power, that collective bargaining that can actually make things, make change happen. But it's tough when like you are not, if you're not living in that building, or if there's a particular tenant who has a problem. So it's more so a place for us to come in and try and give advice, or like these are the skills that we've learned, and trying to encourage people to form their own unions and their own kind of like autonomous collective bargaining blocks. So yeah, we've been working with a tenant union in Boston who's had like a lot of success, and we've kind of gone under their wing and are doing trainings right now to just try and be as an effective support for the community as we can. I don't know if I veered off from the question.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think that's all really important. And the first thing that comes to mind, and I didn't realize that you both were coming from Tacoma, but that will probably give you a nice perspective, because a lot of the folks on the call here are based in the Chittenden County region. Mm-hmm. And although the housing advocacy program, including the Fair Housing Project, are statewide programs, as you are sharing with us today, our reach can be really limited. We're not reaching the communities that really need us. And so I'm wondering if you could share what you are finding unique or different or challenging about renting in more rural spaces, and where are those apartments, and what does it look like to be living as a renter in a space that isn't like as dense as Burlington, for instance.
Bleak.
Yeah, as everyone in the documentary trailer said, housing is bleak right now. There's an immense shortage. So as our documentary explores, it's about a 1% vacancy rate here in the Upper Valley right now, which means that if you're trying to find housing, like there's just nothing available. Everything's filled up everywhere, and the stuff that is available is so overpriced that it's basically inaccessible to people who aren't making like at least 60 grand a year, which the jobs aren't paying here. So that's definitely been a challenge. In terms of organizing, something that's been challenging is, for us, a lot of the landlords around here are kind of like small time. They're like local developers. A lot of times they're like people who are seen as community leaders. And so getting the tenants to recognize that the landlords are like it's easy to organize when you have like a big evil corporation coming in and buying up all the housing. That's definitely been happening here recently too. But getting tenants to recognize that even like that little old lady who's like making it through retirement off of, charging $1,500 for a studio apartment is like just as bad as the big evil corporation. That's been a real challenge. That and the lack of protections too. A lot of tenants, even though they recognize that there are issues, are scared to organize, and for good reason, because it's so easy to just evict, rabble rousers in your building and know that there'll be someone else to take the spot, and it doesn't really question things.
Yeah, and I feel like consistently local officials and policymakers and whatnot and Loop Forth have consistently, I feel like, demonstrated that they have a keen interest in allowing that practice to remain, and to like not advocate for things like just cause evictions and for that reason, because it makes it less viable for people to do something about it. I feel like another unique thing that I've only experienced since living here and kind of like becoming, or kind of getting acquainted, one, with the community, and then particularly in this, since we've been doing this documentary and talking to different people in whatever their capacities are around, but there is a very unique attachment to the land here, which, it's not even ours to begin with, but that is a whole other conversation. But there is a very like a deep-seated desire that like, oh, this is our Vermont rural land and I need to have 37 acres of, and like, I think there is like a point and there is like an angle for like conservation that is, important and relevant, but more and more, I think it's more like in the conversations that we're having around housing and development and zoning, I think the pushback to it is more like aesthetic than anything. People are just like, yeah, I don't want these big dense buildings. I don't think we should, zone in ways that would allow for there to be less than a 1% vacancy rate.
People are worried about the character of the community.
The character of the community. Yeah, that's
Can't supply. That's always the word. Like it doesn't fit the character of the community. And there's like, yeah, well, it's funny. If you are available next Friday for our final Fair Housing Friday, we're going to be hearing from John Hafner from Vital Communities and talking about just that, how Vermonters have this like iconic image of what it looks like to be Vermont. And it's like, he pulls up this like picture of like, if you Google image search Vermont, it's like a red barn and a single family dwelling on all the land, but it's not. The reality is that we have historically actually have had denser downtown centers. And I'm not the expert. We'll hear from John about that next week. But just really what you're talking about is this kind of like internal image, like who we believe we are. And then the other thing too is, like the question about like landlords and them being like, like people in the community, like leaders in the community, perhaps like your friend, or maybe you went to school with them. And something that we always say in our tenant skills class, which we will be teaching at Junction Arts Media in May, and really looking forward to sharing the wealth of knowledge to all the work that you both are doing. But a landlord doesn't have to take a class. So it might be that, like whether or not it's intentional, when they're like breaking the law, they just don't, like sometimes don't know. And then if the tenant doesn't know, there's no one there to advocate for the tenant. And if the tenant does know, it's still, that power dynamic of the tenant being in that position where they have to kind of assert their needs under, landlord tenant law or fair housing law. So yeah, really complex, just a complex problem. And I'm wondering, did you find anything, like what did you learn in doing this documentary project? Was there anything like surprising or stories that really stick with you?
You want to go first this time?
I think for me, I learned that a lot of people are landlords. A lot of people that I probably wouldn't expect, or yeah, I think that was for me what was most interesting, and kind of what Maeve touched on earlier, just the general attitudes toward landlords and especially places here where they're like local, like they're the good guys. They're just trying to, I don't know, hoard their wealth. And
one thing we've heard a lot is landlords provide us housing.
What about you?
Something that was really surprising. We interviewed Simon, who's the gentleman. He is a co-founder of Dick's, right?
Stories into Good Shelter.
So they do a lot of outreach and work with the unhoused population. And so I'm from Seattle, and the unhoused population out there is very visible. Like every underpass, every like unoccupied public space is full of like tents and improvised shelters, and you don't really see that out here. I think mostly, I guess, because of the weather. It's just like you can't be outside around here. So I was surprised to learn that Vermont in the Upper Valley had such an extensive unhoused population, and it only makes sense, right? There's a housing shortage. We can't afford, like the wages here aren't paying enough to afford the housing. So it makes sense, but it was really surprising to hear that it was such an issue here. So that was really surprising to learn. And also, yeah, like the NIMBYism that exists around like people have like shot down plans to build shelters and stuff for these people. So we have like this issue where obviously people can't afford housing. So there's going to inevitably be an unhoused population of people who are like working, contributing to the economy and the community, but just can't afford to live in a home. And they still don't want to provide services for these people.
The NIMBYism was surprising, particularly, it's interesting, especially where we live, we're literally kind of on the border, like we live in New Hampshire, but like we work in Vermont, and so there's the ebb and flow and there's differences, but in many ways it's fairly the same in the Upper Valley. But I feel like there's the attitude of Vermont as like being this like very outwardly liberal leaning, whatever you want to call that state, yet every time it seems like when it comes to like, I don't know, kind of put the money where the mouth is, we're falling short, I think. So yeah, that's been interesting.
Yeah, the other thing that was not surprising but frustrating to learn about throughout the course of the documentary was the towns. Basically, all of the towns around here recognize there is a housing shortage and a crisis, and they're doing things to address it, but their plans all basically revolve around empowering and incentivizing local developers and landlords to build more housing, which would address the shorting issue, but does nothing to address like the inherent power differential between landlords and tenants. And there really is no difference between like local landlords and big corporations. So that was like a little disheartening to hear. But I guess that's where our tenant organizing work becomes even more important.
Oh, we have an urgent question in the audience.
Of course.
Jess, go ahead.
Well, it wasn't an urgent question, just a question. I'm curious to know, so as you were interviewing folks for this documentary, what were some of the big ideas that came up? I mean, oftentimes there are bright spots that local decision makers never get to hear, or ideas, like little ideas that can make a big difference. And I'm wondering what you heard from the folks you interviewed. And we know so much about what isn't working, but I'm guessing they had some really good ideas for changes that could make the system work a little better. And I'm wondering if you could share what you heard.
It's a good question. I would say, so yeah, we interviewed a kind of a range of different people. One thing that we are still lacking in need, I think that's kind of our next round of interviews that we want to collect, or we need a lot more of the tenant perspective. We spend a lot of time getting like a lot of the people featured in that are like government officials, like select board members, and people in like the Department of Planning offices in around here. And so from them, I feel like the catch-all or like big solution bright spot that they're kind of putting all their chips into are these things called ADUs, or like accessory dwelling units, is like kind of the thing that we're going for. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I have strong opinions on it yet, but I guess the idea is that like that is the quickest, more efficient way to like immediately solve the problem, or just like providing more housing, because it takes a lot less time and like labor and all of these things than like putting up, a 5-6 story apartment building. You can just plop a shed or some kind of dwelling unit on top of an already existing property, which does solve it. That is a house that someone can live in, but as Maeve said, still doesn't really address any of the other problems. Yeah, I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, one thing we heard from Simon a lot is there's like a big need for a low barrier shelter. A lot of people are staying out in the winter because the shelters that are here are just inaccessible by the unhoused population. And so, yeah, I mean, the plan was shot down, but like people are out in negative weather. And that like needs to be addressed, I feel like, first and foremost.
Yeah, it's tough. I'm trying to, because I feel like the question was like, what is like a really cool idea that you've heard that like, you know, that maybe could solve a lot of problems. But that is one thing that I've been kind of struggling with, especially in trying to maintain what's the word? Impartiality when like approaching this as like a documentary, is that like to me, they're just like there is only one solution, and that is, I mean, it's like revolution. It's like complete, like in order for housing to be accessible to everyone, and in order for it to be, you know, the right afforded to people as it should be, there needs to be a complete rehaul of the system itself. Like no amount of small policy changes, you know, there are things that can definitely help and can be of immediate like relief and in harm reduction in many ways, like you know, just cause eviction laws and more protections for tenants and building accessory dwelling units so people aren't actively like on the street. But at the end of the day, it's just like hard for me to reconcile like calling any of these like solutions or like really without, I guess, like thinking of it within the context of the bigger picture, with the larger end goal being like a huge like systemic overhaul in the way that we think about housing as a whole, and in the way that we house people in our country.
It's true. Yeah, I guess the answer to your question is socialized housing is what we do.
Yeah,
Mhm.
but no one is saying that. That's what we're trying to pull out of people, hopefully. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious when you keep delving down this hole, if you have the opportunity to interview folks living in affordable housing, so renters in affordable housing, I'd be curious to hear, you know, how their perspectives either echo or counter the renters that are renting for private landlords, and especially some of these sentiments around like the power dynamic, which like, you know, opening up a little bit of a can of worms there. We have a lot of affordable housing advocates in our community just doing very hard and important work. And also we know that there is, when we have a shortage like this, if you're a person that needs affordable housing, it really limits choice in that. And a big part of the Fair Housing Act's intention is housing choice. So, you know, the problem is still there, right? Oh man, I had a question I was about to say. Oh, and the other comment I was just gonna make, oh, and Jess, I'll call on you in 1 second. But the other comment that just really stuck with me, Maeve, is when you mentioned the visibility of houseless folks. I think that that's something that you know, we really struggle with, because just as we have this idea of what a house can look like, you know, the single family dwelling with the red barn and like the rolling hills or whatever. So too, we have an idea of what it looks like to be homeless, and it's usually, and I think it's in part because it can be so visible. Like there really isn't a lot to protect folks from that kind of public eye. You know, the home is a private space, and if you don't have that, you don't have the right to your own privacy. But you know, there is so many different ways houselessness can look, and you know, couch surfing, staying like cabins that don't have heating, so like seasonal cabins, sleeping in cars, sleeping in campers, you know, overcrowding, sleeping in you know, in someone's living room. There's just so many ways that it can look like to be in a vulnerable housing situation. And Jess, did you have a question?
Oh, I just wanted to point out that Beth had a question in the chat earlier that I missed. Beth, did you want to ask that?
Sure. Also, yeah, I can't find my raise hand thing, so I don't know if I haven't updated my Zoom or something, but anyway. Basically, thanks so much for sharing the trailer, like the preview, and I'm really excited to watch the whole thing when it gets released. Especially because I think Corinne was saying as well that so much of the housing stuff is kind of focused on Chittenden. It's really interesting to see perspectives from elsewhere. And I'm interested in, you said at one point about how you work in Vermont but live in New Hampshire. And I'm interested in hearing if like that came up a lot in the interviews you were doing with people, if there's kind of issues or like, I don't know, challenges, even kind of benefits of being in a place that straddles two states, especially in terms of kind of like tenant protections. I know like Vermont, like Corinne was saying, has added stuff onto the Fair Housing Act that like I don't know if New Hampshire has, and if there's things that come up like that, because I think it's kind of, it's an interesting situation to be in, kind of stuck between two states in terms of policy and things like that.
Yeah, I feel like the Upper Valley kind of feels like its own. The Upper Valley spans towns across both states, but it kind of feels like its own kind of like community and microcosm in a lot of ways. So we haven't really run into like a lot of the legal system yet. So there might be big differences there. I know there was a big push in Vermont to get just cause eviction laws passed, some more tenant protections, and it's basically failed in almost every town that they've tried to pass these laws in, and at the state level as well. So yeah, we haven't noticed honestly a huge like difference in policy or culture or anything across the state lines. I think a lot of people here kind of really flow across state lines, and it's almost like it doesn't feel like there's a division in the middle. Like I said, it feels like the Upper Valley is kind of like its own thing, and like the other states are just like other places.
I feel like socially that's definitely true, and not necessarily I feel like have we run into it particularly in the course of pursuing this documentary, but just in general, I'm trying to like remember, I was at some kind of thing where it was like a brunch and I was learning things about like, it was like, oh, it was like a cross class like collaboration seminar. I don't know, but I do know that there are like lots of different struggles when it comes to like, because it is so like free moving, and sometimes like you just, if there is housing somewhere and you need housing, like sometimes you don't really have a choice. Like if you need to move into a different state, you have to move into a different state, but then along with it comes like a whole bunch, because there are differences in the ways that the states function. I don't know, like at a governmental level, there are lots of issues where I've heard of people being like clogged up by paperwork or like a lack of support, or like in social services, going from a town that like really was able to support them and support whatever kind of you know, government like program food stamp situation that they're on, and then moving to a place where then they don't have that, or they don't have that kind of support. And so that can be pretty jarring and pretty like having to reacquaint yourself with like a whole new like kind of legislative government, I don't know, system. It's definitely tough, but you don't necessarily feel all that. You don't feel a divide, I feel like, socially. Although, I mean, I don't know, depends on where you go. I feel like in New Hampshire, some places definitely feel very New Hampshire, it's giving live free or die energy, but yeah.
I am now remembering, this wasn't a question, but when you brought up one of the solutions at the ADU, I just chuckled because it has been a very popular solution, especially in the past couple of years. And the reason is just as you said, because it's like the burden is on the individual. They don't have to jump through all the things that affordable housing developers do, which include like securing funding, you know, like going through all the review processes, Act 250, getting the community on board, you know, trying to, you know, like preemptively not have the NIMBY pushback, which often happens anyways. And I did just want to know too, just added to the chat. So, and I'm curious about this. So as I mentioned kind of in my intro, every state has the option to expand their protected classes. So in Vermont, for instance, we have receipt of public assistance as a protected class. So it theoretically, folks with a housing voucher, such as a housing choice voucher, formerly known as Section 8 voucher, could not be turned away from housing based on having that voucher. So it would be illegal for a landlord to say, for instance, I don't take Section 8 here in Vermont. Whereas I'm noticing that in New Hampshire, I'm just double checking, they don't have that as a protected class. So it is legal for a landlord to not, to specifically decide to not take people that have, for instance, a Section 8 or a housing choice voucher. And my curiosity is in this, like, and are you both, I'm kind of assumed you're both renters since you're like organizing the renter community.
Wouldn't it be crazy if we were landlords?
I mean, I would like, I think it would be better for, like, to have like folks that are working so hard to make access to housing and, you know, countering that power dynamic. Like, I don't know, I think that in that way, like, could only be better for it. But
no, yeah, we rent. And
yeah,
we're struggling with that right now at the moment. People are raising our rent.
like struggling with the cost of your rent.
Yeah, like
We pay as much for a 1-bedroom here in the middle of nowhere as we did for a 2-bedroom in the middle of the city in Tacoma.
and they just a development company bought out our property management company or whoever, and so are now raising our rent, which is fun. And so yeah, we're truly like becoming the stars of our own documentary, because we're like trying to figure out, because we kind of want to move not only for that, but we also have a crazy Karen neighbor who has been trying to call the cops on us every day. So trying to get out of that situation, but I'm struggling because can't find another place to live.
Well, in terms of your neighbor calling the cops, in case you didn't know, oh shoot, you're renting in New Hampshire.
We live in New Hampshire, yeah.
We're trying to move to Vermont.
Yeah, I was gonna, you know, because we do, I mean, of course, the Fair Housing Act exists in New Hampshire. But just to say, if you wanted to connect with someone around, you know, your fair housing rights, we can try and connect you to someone that is actually based in New Hampshire.
Appreciate that.
We're here for that. But also, the thing that I was kind of thinking about is just, you know, when you said it feels the same, you know, like renting in New Hampshire as Vermont, I wonder about, as we know here at the Fair Housing Act, and probably a lot of folks in this call, while, you know, certain kinds of discrimination are illegal, most discrimination goes unreported. And that's just as you both were saying, because there's this power dynamic, people are desperate for housing, people will endure more for housing. So it makes me wonder, you know, like if access to this education around fair housing rights and landlord tenant rights in the Vermont region is too limited, you know, is it getting to folks that need those resources? And B, is it just that the shortage is you know, like if there's such a housing shortage that folks don't feel comfortable reporting discrimination or are just so desperate that they'll endure it, like are expanding our fair housing protections actually doing what we want? And I'm just kind of like, not to say that's not important, I'm just like, you know, noticing or wondering about that. And then
could I jump in on that for just 1 sec, Corinne?
yes.
And also, you know, there's an opportunity that I think we should be exploring in Vermont and also in New Hampshire, is that, you know, there are opportunities for municipalities to actually engage in fair housing enforcement. So, you know, here in Vermont, the enforcement happens through HUD, through the Human Rights Commission, through the U.S. Attorney's Office with the support of Vermont Legal Aid. And that's a limiting factor, and that makes it difficult for enforcement to happen because of capacity issues, because of all the reasons that Corinne mentioned about people, not feeling comfortable reporting, being afraid of retaliation, or, just the time that it takes for enforcement to happen. But municipalities in other parts of the country have added more fair housing protections and local enforcement provisions that can be more direct and quick and with quicker resolutions. And I think that's a great opportunity for us to be looking at.
Yeah, I totally agree too. Like it definitely doesn't hurt. The more people who know their rights, the better. I think a lot of the problem too is again, going back to this power imbalance, even if a tenant does know their rights and they know they're being screwed over and the landlord's doing illegal stuff, if the housing market is such that you have to work 2 or 3 jobs just to put food on the table and keep your housing secure, it might be easier just to move if the landlord really wants you gone. And even if you know what they're doing is illegal, you may not have the time or money, even with the government assistance, to go to court and fight this. Like you might not have time to take off your job. Landlords, they're through this power dynamic, they're able to extract wealth from their tenants. They don't have to go work 3 jobs. They have all the time in the world to go sit in court all day and like screw over their tenants. So I think the work that's being done in terms of like fair housing and like the legal stuff is very important. But what's needed alongside that to make those things effective is equalizing this power imbalance. And I think that's where like tenants coming together to form collective bargaining blocks, just like with labor unions, like a single worker alone has no leverage over their employer, but when the whole workplace gets together, they're able to make demands of their employer. The same thing works for housing. So what we need to do is build tenant networks. We need to get people out there getting to know their neighbors. And in that way, they can also help each other out. So it's like, if you have to go to court to fight your landlord, like maybe one of your neighbors can watch your kids for the day, or like bring you groceries or whatever, and like through these mutual aid programs, you can build working class power that can then leverage against the power that landlords inherently have over tenants as well. I think they kind of go hand in hand, what you guys do and what we do.
I'm like, Jordyn, did you have anything else you want to say before I?
No, that was, yeah.
I just, that sentiment, Maeve, of, knowing your neighbors, watching the kids, like while you go to court, that's such a powerful and beautiful sentiment, something that we can really think about in terms of building resilient communities in so many ways. How do we create spaces where people are creating those connections and really knowing each other, really knowing each other's names, not, for instance, and I don't know about your neighbor situation, but we get calls like this pretty often where, a neighbor is calling being like, my neighbor is always with this loud music, like whatever. And then the first question is like, hey, well, did you talk to them? Did you let them know that, for instance, you work at 5 in the morning? And oftentimes the answer is no. And what we find and think about here, which maybe you're finding and thinking about there, if there's a market where folks are constantly being displaced, it really limits the opportunity to build those connections and relationships with your neighbors that actually just make safer communities and more inclusive communities overall.
Yeah, that is a big challenge with tenant organizing, because with labor organizing, everyone in the workplace already knows each other. Like you have to work together and cooperate. And so you build this rapport, which you can then use to like build a network or like leverage negotiations from. But like with tenant organizing, most people don't know their neighbors, like you said. And so it's like hard to build like a cooperative network when everyone is strangers. And so for a lot of the tenants organizing work, the first thing we do is we're like, all right, let's get all the neighbors together and like have a barbecue or something, so they can just like meet each other and talk about like what their common goals and interests are. That's really like the first step. And yeah, it's a huge barrier to tenants organizing, because like even in our own building, I've tried to go and talk to our neighbors, and like you knock on the door and they're like, what do you want? Which is fair. Like I feel the same way when people knock on my door. In a lot of these places, we don't have like common spaces where people hang out like you would like a college dorm or something. So it's a big challenge for sure.
Yeah, and just from our audience, feel free if you have a question, and if you don't have the raise hand feature, you can type it in the chat. You can put an emoji. Oh, Wendy has a question. Is literally raising her hand.
Yeah, I thought that'd probably work. Thanks so much for being here, and I really loved the beginning of that the documentary and just the power of the story, you know, the stories that people were telling. And you know, we can have all the book knowledge that, you know, and all the news, you know, about the housing crisis, but if we bring that human kind of element into it, it is so easy to relate to, and it is so much quicker for me anyway. I mean, I love documentary kind of, you know, documentaries, and I love learning that way. So I'm psyched about what you're doing. I just wondered if you could give us like a little sneak peek about where the documentary is going, if you know that yet, or if you don't, fair enough. But I was just kind of curious about, you know, where you see it going.
When you see going, do you mean like as far as the content, or like distribution, or like screenings and exhibition?
Yeah. So not about conclusion, you know, but more about like, you know, maybe just kind of like the topic areas, or are you going to follow somebody's experience, or I guess I was just sort of curious if that has become sort of clear to you yet or not.
You know, right now, at the place where it's at, we were just talking to Corinne about this a little bit earlier, of like, I'm kind of at this moment now of like, every day I'm just like, oh, I could get this perspective, or I could get this perspective, and it keeps like, I'm like, oh, it'll never end, because I'm like, there's so many things that I would love to touch on and love to explore more. And so I'm constantly like, I don't know, it might never end. But I don't know, eventually you gotta just stop yourself. And I think right now, as we're getting to that point, we've kind of identified the last couple of gaps that we need to fill in. One, we want to speak to more tenants, physically people, and kind of, like you said, share those kind of firsthand accounts, because I feel like that is incredibly powerful and incredibly like it's easy to it's an easy way in for lots of people, especially people who don't like have that kind of more theoretical or like, you know, background where they're thinking about these things a lot. So we definitely need that angle. And I think where it's kind of landed, or where as the way it's laid out in our timeline right now, is we kind of we explore like, this is like what the problem is at kind of just like a brass tacks level. These are the problems. This is what like the government response has been, and their kind of solutions. And then we kind of get into a little bit more of a discussion of kind of why, and we have a few of our like tenant organizers speaking to like why that government solution is, you know, not necessarily like the be all end all, and why ADUs aren't going to save us all. We kind of get to that. And so I think the end is kind of like bridging kind of that last question, or like that last moment we had of kind of saying how like why we need you know, local lawmakers to be putting these policies into place, why we need X, Y, and Z, but why that is not sufficient without the added kind of layer of getting tenants organized and giving them power, essentially, and having them build that power for themselves, so that in tandem with these policy changes and with the government response is like the only way that kind of, at least just people are going to be helped in some way or supported. I think that's kind of where it's ending, or where we're kind of trying to get at the end. Yeah.
Thank you. I realize that's a really hard question to answer, but because
No,
it's a
I mean,
creative process, and it's a process of discovery, but it will be really fun and exciting to see where it goes, and we look forward to seeing that when it's in, you know, shareable.
If we ever finish it.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, like, my thought was like, oh, there must be some housing co-ops down in that region, and that's another kind of like avenue that I'd be curious to hear about, because as it does have that shared sense of responsibility and ownership in space, but as someone that's worked a lot with housing co-ops, I can tell you it's not without its own challenges too. And I'm also just like, oh, I need to connect you both to our mobile home program that works with mobile home communities across the state. But now I'm just adding to your list and
No,
making
please. I mean, I hate it, but I love it. Like, I want to, even if it, sometimes in these things, it will kind of lead it down its own path of exploration, and maybe it just, kind of becomes its own thing that we explore it in a separate kind of format. But please connect me with all the things.
Yeah, well, we love the work that you're doing. It is really incredible, and I can't even explain to you how powerful it is to hear about the housing needs, like the language that's like always in the housing advocacy space, but coming from two community members that are just new to the space and learning, it just somehow it comes out in a way that I think is just more accessible and more reachable for the wider community. In our last 1 minute, I just wanted to give you both the opportunity, if there's a note you want to land on, or a final thought, or something that you want us to walk away with, what is it? Or
yeah, I think the biggest thing I want to impart with the documentary, and just in generally with all of the with all of the political work and organizing work that I do, is that all of these things, like we can pass all these laws that like prevent discrimination and stuff, that's really only treating like the symptoms of the problem. If we want to get like the root of the problem itself, it's that we probably shouldn't have a housing system or any other system for distributing basic human necessities that's built around profit, right? Like the biggest problem here is the housing shortage. Like, if the government could just build housing for people to live in, it wouldn't even be an issue, but we have to like wait for rich people to like do it for us, because we don't have the mechanisms to like address the issue ourselves. It's just an incredibly inefficient system that like doesn't meet the needs of people. And so my biggest thing is just like, let's just do the thing, I'm here for the socialized housing and all of it. So yeah.
I'll kind of leave on two notes. But the first will be, and kind of you touched on this earlier, I think sometimes any kind of organizing can feel very like fruit, like whatever the opposite of fruitful is, like fruitless. It's like you're giving a lot, and sometimes it's tough, because like we little people trying to solve really big problems that in many ways are like so like beyond our control. And there are lots of things that we can do, and that's what organizing is for, to try and bring us wee little people into bigger people that can make that change. But that's there have been so many people before me, and there will be so many people after me that are like fighting this fight. So sometimes it does feel a little bit hopeless, and I get a little bit distraught about that. But something that I always kind of come back to is that even if our organizing isn't changing the world or sparking this revolution the way that we want it, at the very least, like Maeve said, like it's forming community. It's forcing people to create these kind of like almost like something that I care a lot about, like radical care networks. Like, even if we're realizing that these kind of outside entities are kind of the problem, it's nice to in some ways feel like maybe you don't have to be wholly reliant on them, because you can form these communities, these groups of people that can kind of take care of ourselves and offer support and like be there for one another. So even if your tenant organizing group isn't performing rent strikes and doing all these things, at least you've got a community of people that are getting together, that are talking about these things that you can, you know, empathize with and share and process and grieve and all of these things and kind of take care of one another. So that's been something that has been really, really great for me in organizing, is just like kind of been meeting people and forming community, which is, you know, very like harm reductive in its own way. So I guess, yeah, just that not all is lost, even if we're not toppling government.
Take away, build, organize your workplace, organize your housing, and build working class power.
Power, yeah. And then I'll also say, yeah, if you are interested in the documentary, I can't tell you when it'll be done, but we're aiming for sometime in the summer, and we want to have a screening. So keep an eye out. uvjam.org is our website, the Junction Arts and Media website. When we have a screening date solidified, we'll post it on there and advertise it. So please come out and see it and support. And yeah.
Yeah, and for everyone on this call, we will once we have the news, we'll make sure that the folks that registered for this this workshop get the news too. So we'll just make sure that we send that to you. And then with our recording, when we put it out, we do connect folks to the different resources we talked about. So we'll be doing that as well. And
Awesome.
In this group, I think importantly, we'll be also connecting to tenants' rights resources too. So that will be up on our website. And then the other thing I'll just say, I think Jordyn and Maeve, you both would really find the last Fair Housing Friday interesting in terms of this question around agency and the power dynamic. So that's available on our website.
Okay,
And then, yeah, I'll just close it out. I think it's time. So thank you. This again, I'm just so grateful you both shared your time with us today. I'm also just grateful that we're building this kind of community across the state, which I think is really important. And then just for anyone on the call, we have more Fair Housing events coming up. And I think next week's Fair Housing Friday is going to be a really nice complement to this one. As I said, it's a lot about the vocabulary of housing and how we envision our communities look versus like what we actually need our communities to be. So will be coming up too. And then we have just a lot of great events happening in person, virtually across the state. So please check out our events calendar. And that's it. Thank you, Maeve and Jordyn. This was
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.